Welcome to the Sun's continuing series of forums with statewide candidates for elective office. Today we have Steve Kerrigan. He's running on the Democratic ticket for Lieutenant Governor. Steve, I want to welcome you to the Sun.
Thanks, Jim.
And thank you for making this trip up here today. Steve, why don't you tell us a little about your background? Tell our readers and listeners about your background.
Sure.
And give us a little outline on why you're running for Lieutenant Governor.
Sure. Well, I grew up not that far from here in Lancaster, Mass, North Worcester County. And I say not that far because when you're from Lancaster, anything under an hour is not that far away. Two parents. My dad was a utility worker, two union parents. A utility worker for Mass Electric, climbed poles back in the day when you wore spikes on your feet and not in what he calls fancy bucket trucks. And my mom is still the public elementary school secretary. They raised my brother and sister and I, on relatively limited means, but they gave us a great life and gave us every opportunity. And throughout that, their sacrifices really gave us a chance to have the lives that we have. And I've had an opportunity to serve my community as a selectman and a finance committee member, which I joined the Board of Selectmen and the Finance Committee in the mid-'90s when we were just getting out of the early '90s recession, trying to add back some of the services we had to cut. Which was a difficult time for every community in Massachusetts, as it is now. And I had the chance to serve as Chief of Staff for the Attorney General, Tom Riley, for the last few years of his time in office. Prior to that, I served for 14 years with the late Senator Ted Kennedy, who I think is probably the greatest senator in the history of the Republic.
You look too young to have all that experience.
You're doing all the math in your head, yeah. Well, I was lucky. I served as a selectman while working for Senator Kennedy, which was...
In Lancaster?
Yeah, in Lancaster. Which was an amazing experience. I ran, the first time I ran for selectman, I lost by 26 votes. I was a write-in, and I was grateful that I lost after I got appointed to the Finance Committee, because that's when I realized I had no idea what I was taking on. But it was an amazing experience. I mean, it's really local and municipal government is where the rubber hits the road, and I learned more about governing and policy and how it impacts people directly in that experience than I'd ever before. Since Attorney General Riley's office, I worked on both the president's campaigns, President Obama's campaigns. The first one at the urging of Senator Kennedy. I had been a Hillary person, and then he called me and urged me to go work for the president when he got the nomination, which I did.
Well, I mean, that was very gutsy for the senator to do that, especially when
his
he
endorsement.
And that really, some people say even today that's really broke out Barack Obama's support at that time, and he was good friends with the Clinton family at the time, but he was very prescient in that regard. How did you feel about that when he said...
He and I had a conversation just before he was about to endorse Senator Obama, and I won't disclose most of them because it was a private conversation, but I will say that I told him, because he and I both enjoy competition, I said, you do realize we're going to beat you terribly in the Massachusetts primary. And he said, that's okay. That's okay. We'll be fine. Which, of course, they ended up being just fine. So I went to work in Chicago and then had the honor of being the Chief of Staff for the President's first inauguration in Washington, and then came back here to Massachusetts, and then the White House asked me to run the search for the next Democratic National Convention, which I proudly did, and then the President asked me to serve as the Chief Executive Officer of that, which I did that as well. And then right after he was reelected to a second term, I was asked to be one of the co-chairs and CEO of his second inauguration. So I had an opportunity to do that. All the while, I am the president and chair of a small nonprofit here in Massachusetts called the Mass Military Heroes Fund. It's a fund we created back in 07, 08 and launched really fervently in 09. And we support the families of fallen service members from all across Massachusetts who were lost in active duty or in service to the country since the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And it's built on a model that we created when I worked for Senator Kennedy in the aftermath of the attacks for the Mass 9/11 Fund, which ended up becoming the Mass 9/11 Fund, because we realized back in those days when these 204 families lost a loved one from Massachusetts on that day. And
many from Lowell.
Many, yeah. Yes, exactly. It was a terrible time for these families. Their loved one goes to work, on vacation, whatever, and they're taken from them. And so government at all levels was trying to help, and the nonprofit world was trying to help, and the business community was trying to help, but it was overwhelming. We had a meeting with all of these families probably a month after the attacks, and I remember being there, and we thought we were being incredibly helpful. We got all the families together, and we got 38 different agencies, and federal, state, local, non-governmental agencies all together. And the senator chaired the meeting and said to these folks, look, you've got to be supportive of these families. Whatever they need, you got to give them. And he famously said to the agencies, he said, look, if they have to call you a second time, the third call is going to be from me. You don't want to get that phone call. And it was a wonderful show of commitment. But then this woman got up, shaking, and she said, that's all well and good, but when this is over, who's going to stand up for us? Who's going to fight? She said, it was all I could do to get out of bed. To come to this meeting, and I got 2 small kids, and so that's when we walked out of the room, and I'll never forget this, and the senator stopped me in the hall, and he said, we've got to help her in any way we can. And so we just started feeling our way down the path, and we created an advocate program where we trained a social worker on how to apply for all these programs, and in the end it created the Mass 9/11 Fund. So it's we're small and nimble nonprofits, particularly the Mass Military Heroes Fund.
So is that a full-time position now? Is that?
It's no, we do have a full-time executive director, but
okay.
no, I'm a volunteer board chair, but it's a real passion for us, because it's honestly it's a great example of where government shouldn't, frankly, can't do it all and shouldn't do it all, and the community has an obligation to step in where they can and offer something, which is frankly what my folks taught me at an early age, which sort of inspired my career, and frankly is why I'm running. Because I believe that when you have experience and skills and know-how, and you see an opportunity to step in and make a difference, that you have an obligation to do so.
Well, before we get into some of those issues and why you're running for lieutenant governor, because this is an interesting constitutional office. We have a vacancy now, and no one's rushing to fill it. It's like
I'm rushing to fill it, but there's a timeline.
But here's the point: you've had some
vacancy for quite a while.
You've had some great political mentors. You've worked for both Tom Riley and certainly the Senator Kennedy. So I want to just ask you 1 or 2 key things. Like Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. What are the 1 or 2 key things you've learned from the senator that really has stayed with you, inspired you, and driven you all these years? When you think back of all those years, anything that
it's interesting you say that, because he inspires me every day. I still wear my Ted Strong bracelet that I actually got here in Lowell. Because if you remember, the state convention was here in 2008, right after he was diagnosed, and we had these made up just before the convention. One of the things that I think always connected us, and I asked him about this years and years and years ago, like, how can you keep fighting these fights and keep working so hard? God. And he said to me something that I think about all the time and often talk about, that if you work hard, if you stick by your principles, if you run through every obstacle, or at least don't let them get in the way, and if you believe that a lot of great things can get done if nobody cares about who gets the credit, then you can really accomplish a great deal for your community and your commonwealth and your country. And
that last part of that seems key.
It's key. It is key. It's honestly, it's key across government, and frankly, the nonprofit world. When I talked about the nonprofit we created it to fill a need that existed. There are a lot of folks who are very nice, but in the moment of tragedy, they start launching nonprofits left, right, and center that don't necessarily. It's well intentioned, but it might make them feel good about it, but it doesn't necessarily address the need of the community. I want to be a lieutenant governor that lives sort of by that credo, that the hard work will take care of the politics, and it's the advice I took that advice from him probably almost 20 years ago now, and I live with it every day, and I've given it to students and anybody who always asks me what's the best advice you can give somebody who's embarking on politics or public service, and the only thing I say to them is work hard.
What I find interesting is a lot of guys, men and women who come in here, they've been a selectman or a school board member, then they're a rep or a senator, or, something like that. And just hearing you speak for a few minutes, you strike me as a classic political operative, as opposed to, someone who's on the podium. You're kind of behind the podium, behind whoever that Paul is. So with that said, why lieutenant governor?
So June of 2000.
Kind of getting on his point.
Yeah,
It's kind of a weird office in this state.
It is, but hear me out. Back in June of 2012, I was CEO of the National Convention, and I remember exactly where I was in my office, and I had just reached a boiling point of a level of frustration with the politics in Washington and everything going on. Some of our own party, some of other folks, and a lot of the interpersonal stuff. And I was done. I decided, you know what, forget it. I'm out of politics. I've done way too. I've worked way too hard to be fighting these kind of fights. And I decided I was going to be done. I was going to finish the convention, and then I was going to retire. I had no earthly idea what I was going to do, because as you pointed out, this is what I've been doing my whole life. But I decided enough. This just isn't worth it anymore. And I was pretty comfortable with the choice for a couple weeks. And then I remember sitting there one night, as I used to read through my inbox, which was very high, every night, and I was reading through things. And I had a glass top on a wooden desk, and underneath I had the prayer card from his funeral. That was underneath the glass. And I just sort of glanced down at it, and then I was reading my stuff, and I thought, if I'm this frustrated, the CEO of the Democratic National Convention, clearly, someone who's at least gotten here, if by accident, but at least everyone knows I'm there, and so I'm clearly in a position to know. If I'm this frustrated, what must average everyday voters all across Massachusetts or all across America think? Their frustration level must be 20 times or 100 times or 1,000 times what I was feeling. And then I thought, what would he have told me if he could give me advice? And he would have told me, it's great that you're tired, it's great that you're frustrated, it's all those wonderful things, that's great. But, get up off the mat, dust yourself off, and get to work. Do what we've always done, which is you don't pick the problems because they're easy ones. You take the challenges and the problems because they're there and they need to get solved. And so I thought to myself, how best can I have an impact?
Yeah.
And I went through my career and I said, look, I've spent a lot of time doing this. I could continue to do this, or I could lead by example. And because I do believe we need a new caliber of leader to go back more to my old boss and his mentality and the way he did business. And I thought the best way to do that was to lead by example. Then it comes down to the machinations of the game, right? You sort of look at what's out there. And I frankly think the lieutenant governor's job, because of the ability to work with the governor on the issues that face the Commonwealth at the time, and really help it's almost a chief operating officer sort of aspect for the Commonwealth. And I've managed hundreds of millions of dollars in budgets and thousands of employees and a state agency, all these things, so I understand what it takes to help run the Commonwealth. I thought it was the perfect slot for me. So,
Are you a lawyer?
I am not.
Yeah.
Recently, our columnist, Stato's columnist, Peter Lucas,
Yeah.
he wrote a column about the lieutenant governor's position.
I read that.
Saying how it has worked well when there was a good partnership
Yeah.
with the governor, and the governor was willing to delegate and trust that lieutenant governor, and the duties are expanded.
Right.
And yet there have been some partnerships that just have not gelled
Right.
and have not worked out. So it's interesting that you say that with the governor. I mean, you got 5 people running for governor, I think,
Right.
on the Democratic side. And you're not taking any sides, I
Yeah.
imagine, in that. So you say no matter who, any one of those 5 are elected, you're going to be able to work well with them.
Well, so when I started this, there was nobody running for governor when we started the planning. So it was taking a bit of a flyer. And it had to be a leap of faith because, just as faith is, as a tenet of spiritual faith or political faith, sometimes you just have to step out and take the steps without knowing all the answers first. I got lucky because I do think we have 5 really good candidates for governor. I've known a few of them a lot longer. I've known the treasurer for a very long time, since he was party chair. I've known the attorney general for a very long time, well over a decade. And the others I've gotten to know over time. I knew Juliette Kaim a little bit before this started, but so I do feel comfortable. But it's a risk. And it's a risk because I have no earthly idea. Once we're elected, they could. Who knows what they're going to end up doing. But I do believe, I've talked with all of them over the course. I mean, we all go to events constantly, so they hear what I'd like to do, and I believe we'll actually be able to do something.
Well, that leads us to another interesting point. What do you want to do as a lieutenant governor? What do you see as the role that could be besides, I mean, the presiding over the governor's council meetings are important.
Yes.
Okay, I think you have to be very patient and tolerant with those people. But how can that position evolve or expand without stepping on the governor's toes, but yet doing some productive work that's vital to Massachusetts?
Sure. I think the first thing, we've seen over history some really good examples of lieutenant governors. Paul Cellucci is one who I look to a lot.
The Wells-Cellucci partnership
was a great one.
One of the best
It was one of the best partnerships, and I actually don't get criticized much at Democratic events when I bring up Paul Cellucci, because he was a great lieutenant governor and a good governor. And I personally got to know him well because he was a former selectman, and so we used to next time. Yeah, right. My great grandfather's backyard abutted his father's, the Portuguese side of my family. But so I think he's a great example, as I do think also Tim Murray was in terms of dealing with cities and towns. Governor Cellucci was in dealing with the legislature and helping to shepherd things through. And Tommy ONeill, back further, working with the federal government on their priorities and making sure their funding gets through to Massachusetts. I'm fortunate enough to have experience in all three levels of government. I hope to bring that to bear for the governor. But the number one thing I think that whoever wins needs to tackle is building back trust with the taxpayers. I mean, you guys see it every day. There's a colossal lack of trust with the government, and we're not going to be able to accomplish super meaningful change if we don't build that back. And so I have a few ideas on how to do that. First, I want to start with a competitiveness council right after the election. I want to work with folks all across Massachusetts and all walks of life to look at ways across the board, from tax code to early childhood education to arts and tourism, ways that we can make Massachusetts more competitive. And hi, how are you?
Rick Sobey.
Hi, Rick. How are you? Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
So, because I think there's a lot of ways. I mean, we're a very competitive state with other states, but I think we need to, continue to reach to be much more globally competitive. And I think once we start doing that, we'll find ways to grow our economy and get more resources in. The other side of this is we need to find a way to deliver services much more efficiently and effectively. Folks want, and the DCF example is a perfect example, folks want government to do what they say they're going to do. When government says they're going to protect vulnerable children, they want them to do it. And if they don't do it, then someone has to be held accountable. And so I want to be a part of a transformation that really has to take place. Some of the tax credit stuff I think is critical out in the broad daylight. Folks need to see if a company is getting a tax credit or a tax incentive and it's not paying the dividends that it's supposed to in terms of jobs or expansions that they promised at the beginning. If it's not, we should claw back those resources and put them into the general fund and really start having a conversation Commonwealth-wide about what our future is going to look like.
Do you think anyone has missed the lieutenant governor? Someone
I do.
being in the office since Murray resigned in disgrace?
I do. At least every mayor I've talked to, I've been endorsed by a half a dozen mayors across the state. Mm-hmm. Every one of them miss having that connection because, and I'll tell you, you talk to Gold Star families and veterans groups who worked with him on the Governor's Council on Veterans Affairs, and they miss having that connection as well. Nicole Mani has done a great job chairing that in his absence. But the direct connection for municipal officials, I think, was really critical, and that was probably his key role.
I think you've hit on that a couple times. So it sounds like to me that you envision that office, or do you think that office has become the liaison between the governor's office and local cities and towns? I mean, is that the role of the lieutenant governor today?
It was most recently. I think it can be. I think it can be effectively. I envision it as doing that, but also serving really as an ombudsman for state government, not just for cities and towns, but for businesses, for the cultural community and civic and civil leaders, average everyday citizens. I want to make sure that when we're getting feedback that things aren't working in state government, that we get folks together and make sure that folks are actually getting the government that they deserve for the sacrifice they make. Dollars are too scarce across the board. And we need to make sure that the dollars we're using effectively and efficiently. And I think the lieutenant governor, who better than the second in command to get cabinet secretaries together, agency leaders, be able to access folks in the private sector as well as across the Commonwealth and civic government to really try to work out solutions to problems and make Massachusetts work a little bit better.
I think, despite the unfortunate circumstances of Lieutenant Governor Murray's departure, he understood the gateway cities. Mm-hmm. He was pretty good. When he came to Lowell, he knew what was going on in these mill cities, and I think from New Bedford to Worcester to Lancaster, he understood that. So I think your point is very relevant to have someone in there who could advocate for all the communities, but understand what is taking place in the urban centers. And with that, it leads me to the point, you see that on the federal level, where the president sometimes puts the vice president, Joe Biden, in charge of some task force.
Sure.
And you wonder, why don't governors do that more often?
Right.
Charge their lieutenant governors with setting up a task force or to looking into specific issues and problems. I don't know if they think it might be too political, like you have to be too... No,
I know. Yeah, I don't know.
But when you say building trust and stuff, I mean that would be something I think worth exploring.
I couldn't agree more. I think we have an obligation to the voters, and there have been folks across the campaign since I started talking about trust really early in the campaign, because I was going around hearing candidates running for every office talking about, we're going to grow jobs, we're going to more money for education, more money for roads and bridges, all these things, which are incredibly important. But one day I was sitting there listening to the 11th or 12th candidate before I got to speak, and I thought, how are we going to do any of that? You're not going to do any. You're going to be able to do any of that stuff if the voters actually don't trust you. And I look at the governor's budget that he proposed a year ago, with $1.9 billion increase for transportation and education. Two of the biggest economic development tools are a well-educated worker and good roads and bridges and transportation infrastructure. But that budget was going nowhere for lots of reasons. But on the other side of the paper, I don't know, I didn't look at the Sun that day, but on the other side of the front page had EBT scandal and DTA stuff. And so the average everyday voter looks at the problems in government. And there are thousands of hardworking people who work in government every day to try to provide those goods and services. But the average everyday voter who votes, and they pay taxes here in Massachusetts, and they need to be listened to. They look at, God, we're already, crushing ourselves to pay these tax bills, and you're not doing it right over here. Why am I going to give you $2 billion extra more dollars? And although those projects are worthy of the investment, you can't go back and ask them for that until you've shown them that you have an ability to do the job they hired you to do and spend their dollars well, worthy of the sacrifice that they make.
Given the scandals that you just mentioned, and you didn't mention them all, how confident are you that the Democrats can retain that office? It would seem to me that, and I'm a Democrat, but it would seem to me, that's news to you, right? But it would seem to me that, boy, they're going to have a hard time. If they just look back at the DCF, the compounding, the EBT, just
I think if
everything
if we do things the way we've always done them, everything is harder. But I think both parties need to realize that. We need to stop playing necessarily the safe political game and actually talk to the voters about the government they wish to have.
But how confident are you that the Democrats can retain?
I'm confident, because I'll tell you, you look at the 5 candidates we have running for governor and the 4 of us running for lieutenant governor. You're going to have a team running in November against Charlie Baker and Karen Polito, who have the experience, understand what cities and towns are going through, what folks are dealing with, and who, by the way, weren't a part of, you look at Charlie Baker, the DCF budget that has continued to get gutted over the last 20-something years, started in 1992 when Secretary of Health and Human Services Charlie Baker was Secretary under Weld. That's when they started the evisceration of the human services budgets across state government. You look at Karen Polito, who pushed a move to make every one of the municipal employees' pensions go to a 401k. She called it the Worcester Plan when she was in the legislature. If we had done, my father, as I mentioned earlier, was a Mass Electric union guy. When he retired, he had a 401k based pension. In the late 90s, when the market crashed, he lost a huge chunk of his pension. This is their dollars, and we have an obligation to them to make sure they have a pension to live on. So you're going to have a very clear vision of what the future of Massachusetts needs to look like on our side and on their side. And I think the voters will see that. But we do have work to do overall, both sides, to make sure that voters understand that we respect the fact that there is a colossal trust gap and we have to build that back.
You know, the interesting thing is, you mentioned the, you know, there's 4 candidates for lieutenant governor, 5 for governor. Now, you're going to be going to your convention June 13th, okay? Should all the candidates who are running get their name on the ballot? Now, you've got a threshold that you have to get 15%, okay?
On the first ballot.
On the first ballot, okay? I don't know where you stand on this, if you're confident and hopeful about getting that 15%, but what if you get 14%? You got a good message to tell,
Yeah.
you got a story to tell, you're definitely energetic about it. Why should you be denied a spot on the ballot?
Yeah.
Because you didn't get that other 1%, and yet the voters are supposed to decide. I mean, it's both the Democrat and the Republican Party. I don't understand why
Right.
they have to have this screening process to let people on the ballot.
You know,
And should all 4 lieutenant governor candidates be on the ballot?
if they get the 15%, sure. You know, look, I do think there is something to a viability test to see. You know, we've used this campaign to energize volunteers. We had volunteers at 392 caucuses over the course of the month of February, getting signature papers and talking to voters and getting in front of them and having them tell folks a little bit about me. We've had folks, you know, hundreds of folks out getting those 10,000 signatures over the last few months, and working delegates to try to make sure that we get on the ballot. There's something to that. You know, you need to be able to get more than, you know, 15-20% in September in order to be a good partner, I think, at the top of the ticket. So there is something to the viability question. You know, I have all confidence in the world that I'm pretty sure we'll get on the ballot, but we'll see in 6 weeks. And I'm pretty sure the others will as well.
I had to step over it, but you were talking about the 15%.
Yeah.
Right.
And we've discussed this with other Democratic candidates who've come in. It seems to me, and we've talked about this, that having party insiders decide who's on the ballot kind of, you know, abuts against the democratic principles. Do you think that whole 15% rule should be tweaked so it's more open?
Well, keep in mind,
so you don't have those Democratic insiders who go to the convention, decide who's going to be on the ballot.
Yeah, I mean, keep in mind, if you want to change the scope of the convention, you can take over your caucus and you can elect a new slate of totally new people. I mean, there's an opportunity in every community all across Massachusetts to elect delegates who've never been to a convention before, but who believe in your vision for the Commonwealth. So it's not necessarily, yes, you're right, there's a lot of them that are the same, and I'm not Pollyanna here. Yeah. But there is an opportunity, and there's a democratic process in February where folks are elected to go to the convention. I'm a firm believer that we need to worry about the 950,000 other people who will be voting in September. The rules are the rules of the party. It's my party. I've been a lifelong Democrat, and we'll play by the rules, and we'll get on the ballot, and we'll keep moving forward. I think there's 15%. I honestly don't think is too high a threshold. If you work your campaign, you work hard, and you mobilize volunteers, and you have a message that's compelling and gets to folks, whether they're party insiders or 5,000 total strangers, you've got to be able to get over a little threshold. I mean, that's really only how many people? 700 people?
Yeah.
Something like that.
No, there is something.
And if you're expecting to be the lieutenant governor of Massachusetts 6 months later, 700 people shouldn't be that hard.
No, and I think it shows that you're right. You have to build an organization, and if you don't have the time, the effort, the will, or the creativity to do that, then you probably aren't a viable candidate.
And what are you going to do?
So
and then you got to get 10,000 signatures.
Your defense of the system is spirited and legitimate. Okay,
Hey, look, I'd be open to changes too. I mean, I'm fine with that. But one of these things that we have time every year to talk about these things. And I'm not on the state committee, but the state committee changes. We can have these conversations, but it always seems like we have the conversation just before a convention, rather than in the 4 years intervening to try to figure out when. We had a commission after the '02 convention to discuss the ballot process, and this is what we came up with.
Okay, so just say all 4 candidates get on the ballot, there'll be a primary. Now, what separates Steve Kerrigan, okay, without diminishing anybody else, and again, just talk about yourself,
Sure.
what distinguishes Steve Kerrigan, why he should be the pick? Why he should be the person that Democratic voters will consider in September, that you will bring to office to to the next administration.
Sure.
And for the next 4 years to help Massachusetts grow?
Experience. I've had experience at all levels of government. I've worked with business community in the nonprofit world. I've solved problems. I've spent 25 years working with folks all across the Commonwealth and the country to solve problems in our government and outside our government. The next governor needs a partner who gets it, who understands how to deal with the machinations of it, understands the politics of it, can maneuver on Beacon Hill, but also on Capitol Hill, but also in city halls and town halls and schoolhouses and libraries. I mean, I actually don't envision myself being a very much Beacon Hill based. I'm from Lancaster, you know, so any day I don't have to drive into Boston is I'm fine with that. So I envision myself really working out in state offices, definitely for the first few years, really to connect so that we can start coming up with more efficient and effective ways to run our government. But it's really experience is the determining factor. I have worked hard for my community, my Commonwealth, and my country for the last 25 years, and I want to bring that experience to work each and every day.
What would be that when you are elected, okay, and if you are elected,
your lips to
okay,
God's ears.
with the governor, all right, so you're sitting down, and you're sitting down on Beacon Hill that first night, you're over the celebration, and then you want to lean over and whisper into the governor's ear that first initiative from Steve Kerrigan that you say, this is a great idea I've been thinking about for a long time, that we should probably implement. What is that idea going to be?
The Competitiveness Council. So, because I think it has a very far reach, and not from a political perspective, but really from the impact it can then have on how we govern throughout the whole first term. And so that, frankly, I hope, and I say this on the trail a lot, I hope to start that the day after the election, not the day after the inauguration. So hopefully we're having that conversation on election night, because I think the work is too important to wait until after we're in office. And so that would be the number one.
It's interesting that you mentioned in your opening remarks about the taxes.
Yeah.
And I mean, do you think it's time for tax code reform?
Absolutely.
And what are your thoughts on that? I mean, what do you think along those lines as far as?
I think first of all, the situation that we're entering into a new phase for Massachusetts, you know, and so everything has to be on the table in terms of how we fund things. We've got to look at ed reform funding. We've got to look at local aid funding and Chapter 90 money. But we do have to look at, you know, there are questions all the time of would you approve revenue and, you know, would you improve more money in this line item on questionnaires? And I always tell advocacy groups that we're not going to plan a budget based on questionnaire, but it is an important discussion to have, and I do think the tax system and the tax code and these tax incentives all have to be looked at, because what's happening is if there are holes in the system and ways where we're not getting the revenue that we need or deserve, frankly, and not necessarily looking to overtax, but that we deserve, you're pushing the burden down to cities and towns and to taxpayers. You know, we had, when I was a selectman, I met this very sweet woman who is no longer with us, sadly. She was about 85, and she took me into her house. It was probably November. And it's a really cute house in town. I drive by it almost every day. And she and her husband lived there 50-something years, 55 years maybe. He had passed. Her house was long paid for. Her kids were grown and out of the house. And she showed me the 2 rooms she lived in from October to April, out of her 8-room house that she'd raised 3 kids. And she didn't show me it because she was wanting a pity party or anything. It's just it was between October and April, and she said she would have showed me the rest of the house, but it wasn't open. That was a direct result of the fact that government had failed in a lot of ways. She wasn't complaining. You know, she played by the rules her whole life. She was living off of a pension, Social Security, everything's fine, as far as she was concerned. But I frankly saw a government, the federal government, when it passes unfunded mandates, drives me crazy. Then they pass them on to the state, and then the state does their fair share to then pass more mandates on to cities and towns. And we saw it when I was in Lancaster. Every year, the state would push things down on us, and we wouldn't have the resources to pay for it. So then the city and town has a difficult decision to make. And I was talking about this when I entered the finance committee and the board in the 90s. We were trying to figure out, you know, how to make budget, and the only way when you're down to the wire is cut services or raise property taxes. As you know, we can only go up to 2.5, and that's not going to get you much. And by the way, that then means government is continuing to push the burden down to the taxpayer. Because then when your property tax bill goes up or your services go down, you sit around your kitchen table and you have a decision to make. I've got less resources because I paid more property taxes, or is it worth staying in this town? We're paying too much, we're not getting much services, maybe we uproot the kids and we move to another state where there's actually services in the community. I mean, we're forcing folks to have these discussions. Or, frankly, what temperature they keep their house at. This woman had decided 55 was the right temperature. 85 years old, living at 55 degrees. These are the decisions that people make in their house every day. People don't want a handout. I'm a firm believer that they don't want a handout. Everybody, there's an exception to every rule. People want things just a little easier. They want things just a little easier. She would have loved to have kept it at 60 degrees. People just want things a little easier. Cities and towns, they get that the state's in a tough economic situation, but level funding the dollar amount every year versus the purchasing power amount, like that's just a little easier for them, because a level funding on the dollar amount, as we all know, is a cut. Because everything costs a little bit more.
Steve, you're making too much common sense. You know that, don't you?
Steve, excuse me, I gotta run. I gotta move
Of course.
on.
It's very nice to meet you.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Just, a couple more questions.
Sure.
One is, you mentioned how hard it is tough, and I was, we've been following the education issue, especially higher education with tuitions. We've got a great school, two great schools in Lowell, Middlesex Community College and UMass Lowell, and yet while the legislature has agreed to give the higher education an extra $100 million over the next 2 years, that's just to keep the rates as they are.
Right.
Okay, that was the agreement.
Right.
And yet, you read a story in the Globe how kids who go into private school are actually getting more money, so their tuition is lower than going into public, because the endowments are bigger and they can give these kids more. And I was shocked to learn that. And we have one editor here who, you don't make a whole lot of money in journalism, but he's been able to put 4 girls through Brandeis.
Wow.
He says because at the end of the day, he only had to put up $10,000 because of all the grants they received.
The Association of Independent Colleges and Universities of Massachusetts told me that statistic once, that it was staggering, that kids who graduate with a public degree have more debt than private on average.
This is outrageous.
Staggering, isn't it?
So how do we get our arms around it?
It's prioritizing, which is why I think the Competitiveness Council will help put a sharp lens on things. It's about budget prioritizing, really. I mean, that's what a budget is. It's a priority document, and we can all say, well, there's not enough money. There's a $36 billion budget. There would be enough money. It's just you have to decide how you have to do it in your home budget or here at the Sun. Everybody has to prioritize the dollars they have and how they're going to spend them. And to me, went back to that governor's budget a year ago, the one point that was him saying, look, education, and part of that was helping level the university stuff early on. It's an important investment in our future. The return on investment in a well-educated young person who gets a good job and pays taxes and buys a house and pays property taxes and raises their kids here and contributes to society is huge compared to what we pay for that investment. So it's prioritizing, and there's going to be some difficult decisions that we have to make as a Commonwealth, because not everything can get done. But we have to look at the basic principles of who we are as a Commonwealth, and education's a key one, because our Constitution, when it was written back in 1780 by John Adams, provided for access to public education for every Bay Stater. And I think that should extend through public, and not free, but through public higher education, that there's access to it, and that it's a benefit that's available to folks, and it's high quality and high caliber. And it is. I mean, the education's amazing that we get through the UMass system and the state system, but it's got to be a lot more affordable.
Yeah. Going back to the tax issue once again, Lowell is now considering building a new high school. The high school is in the downtown. The estimates are that it might cost as much as $250 million, and Lowell will still be able to get an 80% reimbursement from the state. But remember, several years ago, when the legislature put 1 penny from the sales tax towards schooling, and yet even to this day now, the funding is not enough for all the communities. and you know, I don't want to hop on you know, just one administration, but you know, the funding to cities and towns has not equalized from what it was pre-recession 2007, and yet the budget has grown $10 billion since 2006. And it just, when you look at it, like you said, people look at it and say, gee, how can that happen? How can, and property taxes have gone up?
Mm-hmm.
And it comes down to priorities. So I guess my question is, you know, I think your point is well taken. I mean, you got to start looking at some of these things and why people are getting turned off to politics. And some people are considering moving out of the state.
Right.
But you owe it. You made a promise to cities and towns,
Yeah.
and you have still not equalized those pre-recession commitments that you made to cities and towns. And that does not bode well for government.
No, I mean, I would.
Was there a question?
I don't know, but bravo, I agree. I mean, that's the thing. It's you know, local government, and I'm honored to have served my community, and still some of the best education I ever got in government. But that's where it happens, and they're somehow they're the easiest ones to cut or not increase, and I don't get it because everyone lives in a community. You know, it doesn't make it. Everyone lives somewhere in Massachusetts. We don't have those unincorporated zones like some other states do. Yeah, and I think that's got to be one of the first things that the next governor tackles is how funding across the board works, particularly relative to local aid and other things, because you end up in a squabble. I had someone tell me once, and I don't know if Dave's ever heard this story, but that someone in the legislature, who will remain nameless, said to me, I said, why is Chapter 90 money so hard to get, the local roads and bridges money, so hard to get an increase? Well, I would think that'd be the easiest thing to get an increase on, because everyone has local roads in their district. And I was told that it was because some legislators didn't believe that they were going to get credit for it. That cities and towns and boards of selectmen and mayors would get credit for it. And I said to them, well, if I'm elected, I will, out of my own pocket, I'll buy one of those big foam check machines, and I'll keep it in my office, and we can crank those things out and give them to anybody so they can go and take credit. Because to my point that I made at the very beginning, who cares who gets the credit for this? Like, it's about making sure that folks have roads that they can drive on to get to work and get to school and all those things. And that the bridges, the 10% of the bridges, and the governor's done well on rapidly expanding bridge maintenance, but there's more work. 10% still are deficient in Massachusetts, 500 bridges.
Well, you know, several years ago, everybody thought the great elixir was going to be casino gambling, and we're
Yeah.
going to get this big pot of money, and now we see where we stand now, and there's a ballot issue, a ballot question. I might even repeal it. Any thoughts on that? Would you repeal the
Well, that's still
gambling?
before the court, right? The ballot question.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But I can't see them turning down a citizen request. They got the signatures, they did it fair and square. I mean, the question comes down to, you know, is it, you know, the state has a law on the books, but we've repealed laws before.
Sure.
You know,
Yeah.
we repealed the tax, okay?
Very quickly.
And other things. So, I mean, do you have any thoughts on casino gaming?
On the casino gaming, I do. I was never a big fan of casinos as, you know, the silver bullet. When I was in the AG's office was when the bill was first starting to get bandied about, although after we left office was when it got passed. We worked hard to make sure that there were strong law enforcement provisions in there, because that was one of our biggest concerns. I remain concerned about 3 casinos plus, you know, a tribe being able to put one in a slot bar, because I think that's an awful lot. That being said, it's the law. I'm hopeful that we will, if it moves forward and it doesn't it doesn't go to the ballot, I'm hopeful that we'll do this in a very deliberate, smart way to make sure that we are building what is necessary and not just these big behemoths. But you look at communities like Springfield, and you know, the law has worked in that regard. You know, the law has allowed smaller communities to vote them down, and communities who feel like they need them to vote them in. And someone told me in one of the communities that is on the list to get one, that they don't understand why the bordering communities get to vote, but why do 350 other towns get to decide what happens in their town? You know, and you know, you look at a community like Springfield who desperately needs economic development. I agree with you. I don't think it's going to be the big boom that everyone believes it can be, or that some believe it can be. But you know, I think the process has played out, and places like Springfield should at least be given a shot.
What was it? I had a last question here, and I thought it was a pretty good one, and now I've been off track on the casino gaming. But well, any closing thoughts at all? I mean, you certainly you certainly, I think, impressed me with your energy, and I wish you well. But I think welcome you to the Sun, and
Thank you.
Any closing thoughts?
No, I would just say, you know, it's great to be in Lowell because of what Lowell has represented, frankly, over the last, you know, several decades. It's really represented sort of the spirit of what we hope to get done across the Commonwealth, because the nonprofit world, the business community, the political leadership at all levels of government have gotten behind Lowell and supported it and found ways to make Lowell and the Merrimack Valley succeed and thrive. And you see that in some places across the Commonwealth of New England, that's not the case. But Lowell is a great example of what you can do when a lot of folks get together and don't really care all that much about who gets the credit in the end, because everybody does. But it really is, for me, I've always loved Lowell, so it's great to be here, and I frankly hope we can take a lot of examples from Lowell and bring them statewide so that we can help Massachusetts continue to move forward.
Well, Steve, I want to thank you very much for coming to the Sun and visiting with us today. Thanks. And hopefully we'll have you back in the near future.
I hope so.
Good luck.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you very much.